It's Friday, January 24th. Welcome to This Week in Impact, where we bring you some of the most interesting impact investing and sustainable finance stories of the week. I'm Brian Walsh, and I'm joined by ImpactAlpha editor David Bank. Today we'll discuss how Trump's executive orders will affect investments in climate, equity, AI, and global development. Plus, why some investors are optimistic about the likely extension of opportunity zones to help direct tax-advantaged capital into underserved communities. And finally, we'll look at an effort to bring more liquidity to private impact funds to enable them to attract more institutional investors. That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. Hi, David. Good to be with you.
Hey, Brian. How are you hanging in there?
I'm doing well. And this is indeed our first podcast under President Trump's second term, and he wasted no time fulfilling his campaign promises. On his first day back in office, Trump issued a series of executive orders with significant implications for investments in climate, equity, artificial intelligence, and global development, among other things. These actions include halting over $300 billion in clean energy loans, withdrawing the U.S. from the Paris Agreement, declaring a national energy emergency to boost fossil fuels, and pausing foreign aid for a comprehensive review. So, David, you and our colleague Amy Cortese, as well as our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk, wrote about some of these orders and their implications for impact investors. So how are impact investors adjusting to this new reality?
Well, it's both early and it's also a flood, as you say, and there were dozens of these, and many of them are, sort of performative, the Gulf of America instead of the Gulf of Mexico, but they will upend investment strategies, no doubt. I mean, just the most obvious example, wind developers, particularly offshore wind developers, whole business plans just got thrown up in the air if they can't get permits that they thought that they were in line for. So there's going to be all kinds of fallouts, all kinds of deals that blow up, all kinds of funds that blow up as well. I mean, we think it's a little bit interesting and ironic in some ways. There's a whole push to lower the cost of energy, for example, as a way to tame inflation and give something back to the voters. Wind and solar have become some of the cheapest forms of energy out there. So there's a bunch of cross currents, to say the least.
And what potential effects could the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, which Trump did in his first term, after all, what could that have on global climate initiatives and the role of private capital in addressing climate change?
Well, those are two different questions, and they're both good ones, which is, it's interesting, it takes a year, and so Trump has started the clock running on the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, which means, frankly, that this year's COP, which takes place in Brazil in November, technically the U.S. will still be in. But clearly the U.S. is not going to be a leader on driving, sort of ever more ambitious climate targets in the global negotiating forums like the COP. And so just at the leadership level, that's a big change. The Biden administration, even on the way out the door, was making quite ambitious targets. Now, meeting them is, of course, a different thing. But without the U.S. kind of jollying everybody along, other countries will also probably see it as a chance to maybe backslide. On the other hand, it's important to remember that when Trump withdrew the first time, nobody followed. There were all the signatories to Paris that might have said, "Oh, now's a good time to get out," and none of them did. And in fact, the noises, this week, is that this global climate transition, this global low carbon energy transition, this global sort of reboot of infrastructure is on. I mean, it's back to the better, cheaper, faster kind of notion that the way that green and energy efficient and sort of modern and tech based and all that is just going to be better. And so folks want to keep these projects going, and that brings us to your second question, which is the role of private capital, and that's, I think, where the acid test is, as it were, and whether projects still pencil out, and that's something we're going to be watching very closely. That was always sort of something of a badge of honor for the energy developers, the renewable energy developers, and companies to say, hey, our projects and our technologies work without any of these government subsidies under the Inflation Reduction Act and other things. And of course, we love to have those kind of incentives, but we always want to make sure that we are based on the real economics of the deals, and now we're going to see whether they are or not.
What about his executive orders around diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives?
Yeah, well, he has some authority over what the federal government policies are, and so that will obviously have a big effect. And what's interesting is there's a sort of parallel battle going on in the corporate world, and there have been sort of campaigns, and there's been a number of high-profile announcements, including from Meta, I think, and Walmart recently, about dropping DEI programs. And what that means, that's not just what people think, which is some kind of workshop or retreat for so employees get along. It's really like is your supply chain diversified so that you can make sure that you're getting the best and the most local, or the best maybe the most environmentally sustainable, but also the most diverse sourcing for your supplies. Are you pulling from the biggest talent pool for your workers? And so companies are going to keep doing those things, despite the high profile announcements. When they're good business. And I think there's lots of research that shows that it is good business. And Costco has been very vocal about sort of pushing back, I think, against the shareholder resolution and saying, look, we're not going to do something that's like against our business, against our customer base, against our employee base. Those are actually the key elements of our business. And your political posturing against some weaponized slogan like DEI is not really material, but having the best workforce, having happy customers, having good supply chain, those are material.
And what about artificial intelligence?
Well, this is interesting, because this was sort of the tipping point, as it were, or maybe the breaking point for the tech folks, or many of these tech billionaires, to go with Trump in the first place, and Elon Musk chief among them. And so there's kind of been I would say, a burst of excitement or enthusiasm, out here in California, at least, and elsewhere, that kind of the guardrails are off on AI, and now the techies can go full speed. And there was an announcement this week about a big data center investment play called Stargate in Texas, and it involves OpenAI and Oracle and SoftBank investing in what they're calling some of the largest AI infrastructure in history. And Trump, they all went to the White House and they announced it. So it's kind of one level, open season for AI, and AI, as everybody knows, been advancing very rapidly, and there's all kinds of questions about what kinds of regulations or guardrails or safeguards should be put in it, not only for the sort of global apocalypse vision, which may or may not come to pass, but for just more prosaic things about misinformation and about trustworthiness and about copyright and IP and other kinds of things. And this is I think seen as like, well, that's going to be sort of secondary to just charging ahead and frankly beating China. I did think it was quite interesting that Elon Musk, who's been Trump's right-hand man and biggest campaign donor and sort of companion all through the transition, took off after that very AI deal, and he's got his own AI interests, but he's been at war with OpenAI's Sam Altman, from long before the campaign and everything. And so you're starting to see the kind of squabbling of the oligarchs, as it were, as they divvy up some of this new pie that's being laid out before them.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the image of maybe Godzilla and King Kong fighting, and the kind of everyday people kind of being in the crosshairs of these titans when the oligarchs fight.
Yeah, well, there's nothing like nothing to stoke a conflict like winning.
Indeed. In light of the pause that the Trump administration has put in foreign aid and their emphasis on, the quote, America First policy agenda, how might investments in global development and equity-focused projects be impacted?
Yeah, foreign aid has always been one of these scapegoats, for certain folks. It's inconsequential almost, part of the budget. But for the places that are getting, assistance, it's obviously important. And a 90-day freeze, in a countries and for projects that are, very close to the bone in terms of necessity and need, is not insignificant. So I think there are folks who are thinking that will have quite a a big effect, and it's not obviously going to go back to normal in 90 days. They're going to be looking closely at all those projects for all kinds of ideological or industrial conflicts that they want to root out. So it'll be a big change. I would say that most of the investment case in emerging markets has not been based on foreign aid. So again, private investment might be the place where some of the seedlings, as it were, of kind of a different kind of economy, of a more inclusive kind of approach, on business basis, right? More customers buying more goods, driving more revenues, increasing the value of companies and paying off for investors as well. That could be relatively insulated. We've always said, through all kinds of different ups and downs in the economy, people are always going to need to satisfy their basic needs of, food, shelter, healthcare, education, housing. And, emerging market spending and thus investing, tilts towards that. There's been a push, obviously, among impact investors, but even more broadly, to be reaching a whole class of emerging middle class consumers in these countries. And again, vast spending power, lots of new kinds of approaches and solutions and products coming to the market. And, yes, there are ways in which the government plays a role, the U.S. government plays a role, but it's not actually the central role. And those kind of investments, should proceed and will proceed, and maybe a bright spot.
All right. Well, you can read this article on Trump's executive orders and the impact on impact investors on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. But for now, let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll discuss how opportunity zones are likely to be re-upped this year.
Ever found something so good you had to share? I'm Mary Carmen Gonzalez, Impact Alpha's Director of Subscription Growth. Impact Alpha subscribers can now gift articles to non-subscribers. Just log onto your account, find the article you'd like to share, and click the share icon on the left. Subscribers can gift 10 articles per month. Enjoy!
Opportunity zones were established under the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in Trump's first term, designed to give investors a tax break on long-term capital gains so long as they invested in designated low-income census tracts. As our Rudy Sonatas reported this week, to date, it's believed that opportunity zones have mobilized up to $84 billion in private equity investments aimed at revitalizing nearly 9,000 designated low-income communities. The program's tax incentives were designed to expire in 2025, so with Trump back in office and with Republican control of both houses of Congress, although with razor-thin margins, investors and fund managers are optimistic about the potential extension or even a permanent enactment of opportunity zones. So, David, these opportunity zones have enjoyed that rare thing in Washington, some level of bipartisan support. Yet, despite the program faces scrutiny regarding its actual impact on community development and the associated costs to the budget. What evidence supports the effectiveness of opportunity zones in achieving meaningful community development? And how do proponents address criticisms regarding their impact?
Well, yes, it's in this category of things that are like, oh, this could be a good idea that both parties and in particular the president could get behind. I think we think that he didn't quite know that it was in the 2017 tax cut. It was a fairly minor and not terribly ballyhooed provision at the time, and then it grew into what people are calling one of the biggest economic development financing sources ever in the country. And the $84 billion I think comes from Senator Tim Scott in a hearing the other day, and he was one of the architects of it back in 2017 and presumably is going to be one of the champions of the renewal, which again might get tucked into the tax bill. And again, it won't be the major part or even the certainly the headline part of the tax bill, but it's something that might be again a bright spot for folks going forward. Now, ever since that first bill was passed, there have been calls and there has been, I think, some action to revise it and to increase the reporting requirements for precisely the reasons that you're saying, because while the original legislation was relatively loosely written, there's arguments, of course, for being able to track the impact in that very census tract that's been designated in neighboring census tracts, which might get sort of spillover effects from development projects, and then, as you say, for for the treasury, or for the lost taxes. Because what folks can do is essentially roll their capital gains, for example, from the stock market into an opportunity zone fund, defer those capital gains, and then if you hold it for a certain amount of time, actually reduce those capital gains. And so, in times when there's been lots of capital gains and the stock market is fairly high, this becomes a good magnet for sort of parking those wins. And so it is a good mechanism for attracting capital, that's for sure. And the folks at the Economic Innovation Group who helped write the legislation and have been tracking it are pretty optimistic and sanguine that the effects have been largely positive. That lots of housing projects have started in these zones, and even if their market rate, that creates a supply that helps keep down rents, and they've tried to track that and say there hasn't been evidence of rental increases even when higher market rate housing goes in the same neighborhood. So that's a sort of a guard against displacement. And then the question of what kinds of businesses get supported, because most of the money has actually gone into real estate projects, and there's always been a big push to try to be able to support operating businesses in these lower income neighborhoods as well. And that's important in and of itself, but it's also important to have folks to fill these commercial real estate developments. And so in any event, the practices and the strategies that work are starting to become well known. They do pencil out as commercial investments. They are attracting commercial capital, and folks think that it will get renewed, and funds are being raised already on that basis.
All right, can you talk about some of these measures that could be implemented to enhance the transparency so that folks know that the Opportunity Zone investments are actually delivering the kind of tangible benefits to the targeted communities that they intend to reach?
Well, there was essentially no impact reporting in the original bill, as I recall, and then there have been some reforms that folks have pushed since then. And so I think it's just knowing what kinds of projects are being invested in, who are the owners of those projects, who are the customers, tenants in those projects, what kinds of income strata is being reached. Again, Economic Innovation Group lays out a pretty compelling case that it is reaching into areas that have been capital starved and that are now getting investment and getting not only economic activity, jobs created in construction, jobs created in the businesses themselves, but also increased taxes to pay for services and things. And yes, there's a gentrification element to it, clearly. And the question is, A, can that be mitigated? And there's lots of interesting strategies around that. And B, how much is additional because of opportunity zones versus what was already going on? Because some of these neighborhoods are quite close to downtowns and whatnot, and are under pressure in any event. And that has led to the stories of abuses where well-connected developers who are doing commercial developments that they would have done anyway because they're in kind of prime urban areas are getting tax breaks, and that's been most of what the scandals so-called have been. And I think what ImpactAlpha has always sort of looked for is anytime you get a tax break like this or something, there's going to be bad actors. That kind of goes without saying. What's kind of more interesting is, are there opportunities to do good projects and to utilize this lever to make stuff happen that wouldn't have happened? And I think there's lots of examples that has been the case.
All right. Well, you can read Rudy's full story on Opportunity Zones on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. But for now, let's take one more quick break. When we come back, we'll take a look at a new plan to bring liquidity to impact investment fund managers. In the evolving landscape of impact investing, liquidity constraints have often deterred institutional limited partners, or LPs, from committing to impact funds. Investors don't want to put money in if they're worried they have to wait too long to get it back. David, you wrote this week about a new effort to address this challenge, the October Liquidity Guarantee Facility, supported by the European Commission. Tell us what this new financing facility, set to launch this year, is trying to accomplish.
Yeah, a friend of ours, Mark Newberg, wrote on LinkedIn that this was the most interesting, boring story he had read all week. And it is a kind of on a wonky topic, but it is kind of part of the real world of impact investing. And the problem that they were trying to set out to solve is that, the less liquidity you have, the harder it is to get your money back as an investor. The more you want for it. You want a premium for tying up your money for longer. And there's been a sort of a bottleneck, I guess, in private equity generally, but also in impact investing. People have not been getting their money back in recent years, and so that's been kind of sand in the gears of the whole mechanism. If you don't get the old money back, you won't put it to work again in a new fund. And so there've been a whole bunch of interesting ideas about how do you increase liquidity in impact investing. And one of the things that are always interesting to me is you take the same investment proposition, a fund that's going to make investments or loans to in a certain kind of way. And if you're holding up that money for 8 or 10 years in a typical fund versus being able to get your money out on a 90-day basis or a 30-day basis or a 10-day basis, the same investment vehicle can have wildly different return expectations. So the more liquid you can be, the lower returns you have to pay. That makes the money cheaper. And what October has done is said, let's not just provide liquidity in a single fund, but let's provide kind of an umbrella of liquidity over a whole bunch of impact funds. And essentially, once the LP, the investor, pays a small premium, almost like an insurance premium, they have a guarantee that they can sell their stake at essentially any time. And October has this line of credit from the European Commission, will buy those stakes. And they have a mechanism, obviously, to set the price. And that means that the institutional investor, the pension funds, can get their money out. And they have some needs or they want to put their money in a different direction. They don't have to wait for the distribution of that whole fund at the end of the 10 years. They can get it out much more quickly, makes them much more ready to go in. And so the idea is that this will not only be a benefit to the investor, but it will actually sort of lubricate the whole mechanism for impact investing. And they have quite an ambitious goal of being able to mobilize 25 billion euros, which is essentially almost the same amount of dollars, for new impact capital within 5 years. So that that this sort of, again, this kind of wonky mechanism actually serves to have a real world impact.
And could the establishment of a secondary market for impact fund stakes, as facilitated by October and other initiatives like it, lead to a reevaluation of return expectations among institutional investors?
Well, that is happening. There is kind of a secondaries market already. It's not very liquid. It's not very active. Last year, the British International Investment sold its stakes in a number of funds that we've talked about here, Avishkar and Novastar and others, to Blue Earth Capital. It's a Swiss company, and they have a secondaries fund. North Sky Capital here in Minneapolis has been in secondaries for a long time, and they think it's quite a good way to pick up stakes in, and you get the diversified stake of the fund manager, and if you pick it up closer to the end of the fund, you're going to get your money back sooner. So you're the secondary, but you're now already 4, 5, or 6 years into a fund, so you're going to get that distribution. And so again, it does make people be more willing to kind of come in and out. And again, if it's more liquid, as you said, the expectations are for returns are lower, the capital is cheaper, and at some level everybody's happy.
When it comes to impact investing, patient capital has often been the word that's used, right? So that you need capital that is willing to be there for the longer term. And it sounds like this is a solution for capital that maybe has some patience, but is perhaps running out of patience at times.
Impatient capital, yeah, absolutely. And this is true, in private equity more broadly. We were taken by Ardian Capital. It's a spin-out from the insurance company AXA, raised $30 billion for its ninth secondaries fund in private equity, and the Axios wrote that up and said when exits are scarce, secondaries are hot, essentially. And so that's kind of where we're at now. And so secondaries, if our listeners take one word, liquidity obviously is one, but secondaries is another they'll be hearing about.
All right. Well, you can read David's full article, including a video interview with the founder of this October Liquidity Guarantee Facility, on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. But for now, that's going to do it for this episode of This Week in Impact. Thank you so much, David.
Thanks, Brian. It's fun as always.
As always, and thank you all for listening. This Week in Impact is a production of Impact Alpha and part of the Impact Alpha podcast network. Smart conversations by and for impact investing professionals. For exclusive stories and insights about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join thousands of other agents of impact by subscribing. Just go to impactalpha.com/subscribe for full access. Thanks, as always, to our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. For David Bank, I'm Brian Walsh. We'll see you next week for more Impact.